with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
Despite the tough rhetoric, Russia did not respond to the joint attack. What's its calculation?
The Russians are also anxious to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States.
What exactly is Russia's role in Syria?
During the Cold War, Syria was really the only ally that the Soviet Union had in the Middle East. And the Russians have wanted to maintain a relationship with Syria.
The world is watching what the U.S. will do next. What are China and North Korea looking for?
Xi Jinping looks at Trump. What does he see? Does he see someone who keeps his promises, keeps his word, is willing to use force, or someone who isn't, who's more Obama-like?
Welcome to Zooming In. I'm Simone Gao. The world was shocked to see the aftermath of the chemical attack in Syria earlier this month. It came shortly after President Trump said he wanted to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria as soon as possible. The world waited to see what the U.S. would do. On Friday, April 13th, the president announced joint precision strikes against Assad military targets by the U.S., UK, and France. Will these strikes be enough to deter Assad from using chemical weapons again? Relations were already tense with Russia, which is the Syrian government's biggest supporter. Will they do anything in response? And what will China and North Korea learn from how the U.S. handles this crisis? We'll look at all these questions and more in this episode of Zooming In.
Tomahawk land attack missiles launched from the guided missile cruiser USS Monterey in the Arabian Sea. It was all over in 2 minutes. U.S., French, and British forces hit 3 suspected Syrian chemical weapons facilities with a total of 105 weapons that all struck their targets at about 4 a.m. April 14th local time. The attack involved ships, aircraft, and 1 submarine operating from the eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the northern Arabian Sea against 3 targets. 1 on the outskirts of Damascus, and 2 others 90 miles to the north. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations said the U.S. is ready to keep the pressure on in Syria.
With yesterday's military action, our message was crystal clear. The United States of America will not allow the Assad regime to continue to use chemical weapons. Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line.
The strikes came about a year after the U.S. fired cruise missiles into Syria the first time. That was in response to the April 4th, 2017 chemical attack that killed over 90 people. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said Friday night that the strikes sent a clear message.
Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable.
The president reiterated on Friday that the U.S. won't stay in Syria long term.
America does not seek an indefinite presence in Syria under no circumstances. As other nations step up their contributions, we look forward to the day when we can bring our warriors home, and great warriors they are. Looking around our very troubled world, Americans have no illusions. We cannot purge the world of evil or act everywhere, there is tyranny. No amount of American blood or treasure can produce lasting peace and security in the Middle East. It's a troubled place. We will try to make it better, but it is a troubled place. The United States will be a partner and a friend, but the fate of the region lies in the hands of its own people.
Advanced Russian air defense systems were believed to be out of range of the 3 targeted sites and were not activated, according to Marine Lieutenant General Kenneth McKenzie, the Joint Staff Director. There's no indication the Russian air defense systems were deployed. Nevertheless, the joint missile strike on Friday makes relations between Russia and the West even more tense.
Before the attacks on Syria took place, I had a discussion with Professor Douglas Struzand from the United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College. He's also an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics. We talked about Russia's capabilities and possible reactions to a U.S. attack. Russia vowed to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria, but what do you think they will actually do? Do they have the ability to shoot down American missiles?
Well, to start with the last question first, they clearly have the ability to shoot down some missiles. As a matter of fact, at least one report suggests that the Syrians themselves were able to shoot down some of the missiles that the Israelis employed in their recent strike on an Iranian facility in Syria. But the United States has the ability to saturate Russian defenses, that is, to fire significantly more missiles than they have available. And this becomes even more true if our allies are involved. And we also have substantial electronic warfare capabilities to overcome those defenses, although the less we reveal of those capabilities, the better, because once we use those capabilities, then our adversaries, actual or potential adversaries, will learn immediately about those techniques, and we would prefer not to reveal that. But the most recent information that I've seen suggests that the United States is trying to do everything possible to avoid striking Russian assets in Syria and provoking a Russian response, and that in spite of that earlier statement that the Russians are also anxious to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States.
Right. Before the most recent chemical attack by Assad, President Trump said he wanted to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria as soon as ISIS is defeated. Do you think that would be a good move? And also, at what point do you think the U.S. should withdraw its troops from Syria?
Well, there has been from the beginning uncertainty, if not confusion, about what exactly U.S. goals in Syria are, whether it is only the defeat of what I prefer to call by its Arabic acronym Daesh, or if there is a broader mission. The problem withdrawing as soon as Daesh is defeated, that is to say, as soon as it holds no more territory, unless there are other changes, the conditions that led to the formation of Daesh will still exist. So we defeated Daesh in the guise of al-Qaeda in Iraq once. We turned away in 2011, and we had to return in 2014, and we don't want to leave the job unfinished. There's also serious questions about the whole future of the region, and if we pull out, we lose almost all of our leverage. We do not want to see Iran really in control of Syria. There are reports, however, that the Iranians are systematically attempting to win over the Shi'i militias in Syria, that is, to shift their loyalty from the Assad regime to Iran. And so we, like it or not, Iran is a strategic adversary. In the long run, Iran probably poses a much more severe threat, both to regional stability and to American interests, than the so-called Islamic State did.
Coming up, how long will the U.S. stay in Syria, and what exactly is Russia's role there?
together to ban.
On April 5th, President Trump said he wanted to withdraw U.S. troops as soon as ISIS is defeated. This was before the poison gas attack occurred in Syria. On Friday night, President Trump explained the purpose of the newest strikes. He also sent a message to Russia and Iran.
The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States. The combined American, British, and French response to these atrocities will integrate all instruments of our national power, military, economic, and diplomatic. We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of prohibited chemical agents. I also have a message tonight for the two governments most responsible for supporting, equipping, and financing the criminal Assad regime. To Iran and to Russia, I ask, what kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators. In 2013, President Putin and his government promised the world that they would guarantee the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. Assad's recent attack and today's response are the direct result of Russia's failure to keep that promise. Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path or if it will join with civilized nations as a force for stability and peace. Hopefully, someday we'll get along with Russia and maybe even Iran, but maybe not.
Ever since the Syrian conflict began in 2011, Russia has supported the Assad regime politically and with military aid. It has been directly involved militarily since September 2015, when it set up an airbase. It also has a naval facility in the Syrian port of Tartus. Russian military expert Pavel Felgenhauer estimated last year that 2,000 to 3,000 Russian mercenaries are fighting in Syria. Although Putin said he won't send ground troops, he did say about 48,000 Russian servicemen have been involved in the campaign. The West largely avoided military engagement in the past. Meanwhile, Russia's military intervention turned the tables in favor of the Assad regime. Russia uses its UN Security Council membership to protect the Syrian government. It has repeatedly vetoed Western-sponsored draft resolutions demanding Assad's resignation. On April 4th, the leaders of Iran, Russia, and Turkey conducted high-level talks about ending the civil war in Syria, but they excluded other Western countries. What exactly is Russia's role in Syria, and why are they there?
To help make sense of Russia's role in Syria, I had earlier spoke to Elliot Abrams, Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, where he supervised the U.S. policy in the Middle East for the White House. Why did Russia get involved in Syria's civil war in the first place? What does Putin want to get out of it?
Syria and Russia have a long relationship that goes back decades, goes back to the time of Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. During the Cold War, Syria was really the only ally that the Soviet Union had in the Middle East. And the Russians have wanted to maintain a relationship with Syria, and in particular, they have wanted to have a base or two military bases there. They have always wanted to have a naval base on the Mediterranean, and the Syrians have now given them that. And they also have a small air base. So this is Putin showing that he is restoring Russia to global influence. Now they have a base in Syria, and showing that he's a good ally to his friends in Syria.
Do you think Russia will have a direct confrontation with the U.S. in Syria?
I do not think there will be any kind of war between the United States and Russia over Syria. You know, in March, I think it was, there was an assault on a position that the Syrian rebels had, but where there were a lot of Americans with them. Now, these were not uniformed Russian soldiers, but they were Russians, what's now been called little green men, meaning basically Russian soldiers out of uniform. They attacked the American base. The Americans killed roughly 200 of these Russians, and the Russian reaction was nothing, non-existent. So I don't think the Russians are looking for a conflict with the U.S., and there isn't going to be one. I think the American reaction should be to strike, to bomb Syrian military facilities. But it has to be a bigger strike than the one that was done in April of 2017. That was a reaction to the use of chemical weapons, and it didn't work in the sense that the Syrians have done it again. So obviously the punishment was not great enough. You know, when they decide to use chemical weapons, they are making the judgment that the benefits they're going to get in terrorizing people, in killing people, are greater than any particular cost in world opinion, let us say. We have to show that the cost of using chemical weapons is much greater, so that the Syrians and others learn that if they're making an amoral realpolitik cost-benefit analysis, the costs are too high, don't do it. So that means to me that we should not only strike whatever units may have undertaken this use of chemical weapons, but we should really destroy a significant portion of Assad's war machine to teach that lesson.
Coming up, as President Trump deals with the conflict in Syria, China and North Korea look on. What are they looking for?
While the Syria conflict is unfolding, there are two critical observers: Chinese President Xi Jinping and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. What are they looking for from President Trump's handling of the Syria crisis? Let's hear from Elia Abrams again. The U.S. has been struggling between two overarching foreign policy philosophies for a long time. On one hand, we in this country value liberty and democracy and think that these values should affect our foreign policy. That is, we have a responsibility to protect and project those values in the world. On the other hand, a lot of us think that the U.S. foreign policy should be centered around the core interest of America. We're not the world, please, and we should not spend tons of money and shed our children's blood on other people's soil. What is your opinion on these two views?
This is, as you say, a very important question about American foreign policy. First, I would say I do not believe the United States has ever sent our soldiers abroad when we did not think we had a core interest. We did not, for example, send troops to Afghanistan to turn it into a democracy. We did that because the Taliban government was protecting and harboring al-Qaeda, which had conducted the 9/11 attacks. We invaded Iraq under President Bush because there was unanimity among intelligence agencies, American, British, French, Israeli, that he had a program for developing nuclear weapons and other non-conventional weapons. If the intelligence agencies had said, no, he doesn't, we would never have sent troops to democratize. It is the case that once we have occupied a country, Japan and Germany in 1945, Iraq and Afghanistan more recently, it is the American practice to try to build a democracy. There were many people who said at the end of the Second World War, oh, Japan, oh, they can't, you don't understand. See, they have the emperor and they have a different culture. But the American view was, no, They have the right to a democratic system, and we were right, and Japan is a great democracy. I would also say that it is important to the United States that the cause of freedom in the world be successful. Why did the United States decide in 1941 to become involved in the war in Europe? Because we believed that the conquest of Europe by Nazi Germany, in which they would control almost all of continental Europe and then invade and conquer England, was going to be a direct threat, military threat, to the United States once they consolidated that control. But I do think that the cause of liberty in the world is an interest of the United States. Not that we send our army. That's a different question. If you believe that it is in the interest of the United States that the cause of liberty be succeeding, then you have to ask the question, okay, what will you do about it? And we do many things that have nothing to do with invasion. And the example I would give you is Reagan's policy toward the Soviet Union. He conducted ideological warfare against it. He called it an evil regime. He conducted economic warfare against it. He did engage in what you might call proxy wars against it in the Third World. For example, fighting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But we didn't have a war with the Soviet Union. I think there are many things we can do. We can support democratic groups, NGOs, civil society. We can work through the United Nations. Not everything is the use of force. But I would not be comfortable with an American foreign policy that said, whether more and more countries become dictatorships or are democracies, doesn't matter to us. We are indifferent. We should take no interest. We should give no assistance to the forces of liberty in the world. I think that would be a big mistake for the United States.
That said, we're not in the Reagan era or the post-World War II era anymore. I think the rest of the world is watching what the U.S. will do next. What does America really perceive its role in the world to be? I think the Obama administration sent the message that America is not interested in maintaining a strong leadership role. It's rather leading from behind. What signal has the Trump administration sent to the world?
I would say the signals from the Trump administration, and we are more than a year into the Trump administration, are not clear. On the one hand, the president wants to make America great again. So a year ago, he does strike Syria on the chemical weapons question, saying America must take a leadership role, and he's probably about to do it again. Yet, he also wants to certainly withdraw American troops from Afghanistan, from Syria, for example. He even talked about NATO. But you know, he hasn't done it. He was persuaded. No, what you want to do in NATO is make it stronger so that the other countries have to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. We want to make NATO stronger, not weaker. Afghanistan, he did not, in fact, bring the troops home because he was persuaded we have to stay there. It's an important role for the United States. So I think we do not yet know where the president will end up as he makes all of these decisions about the American role. He clearly thinks we have borne too great a burden. He feels this on free trade. He feels this on security as well. And I think millions of Americans agree with him. But to say that we have borne too great a burden is not to suggest that no burden is worth bearing. He is not an isolationist. I mean, I think that's become very clear. And in a number of cases, Venezuela and Cuba are two examples. He has been interested in the question of democracy and human rights.
Let's go back to Syria. How will the decisions on Syria affect the U.S.-China trade war and the upcoming summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
I think that all these things are related because they relate in a way to American strength and to the perception of American strength and of Trump's strength on the part of foreign leaders in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran as well. So, for example, if the president does a very powerful strike on Syria. I think, Putin sits back and says, this guy is really ready, willing, and able to use American military power. I need to keep that in mind. I think it even affects non-military things such as the trade relationship. Xi Jinping looked at Trump. What does he see? Does he see someone who keeps his promises, keeps his word, is willing to use force, or someone who isn't, who's more Obama-like? I think it's actually quite important, and that's another reason why I hope the president does quite a forceful move in Syria.
Now that the U.S. has taken action in Syria, we'll soon see if there will be any response from Russia. The strikes send a clear message to the rest of the world that the use of chemical weapons will not be tolerated. With the U.S.-Korean talks coming up, how the U.S. handles this conflict can reveal a lot to China and North Korea. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. This concludes today's program. Thanks for watching. I'm Simone Gao, and we will see you next week.